She left work at 3:01 a.m. By 9 that morning, her estranged husband was on the phone with 911 saying his wife was on the floor, covered in blood, stiff and not moving. And before detectives were done with this case, they would uncover something that turned the entire investigation upside down. The man with the airtight alibi may have been the man who arranged the murder. This is the story of Shauna Tiaffay, a woman who left Utah and built a life in Las Vegas, a cocktail server who thrived in one of the most image-driven cities in America, a mother whose daughter was the center of her world, and the victim of a killing so savage that investigators initially had to consider whether they were dealing with a sexual predator, a stalker, or a stranger lying in wait for women who worked late-night casino shifts. Shauna was born on March 13, 1966, in Salt Lake City, Utah. She spent part of her childhood in Utah, later moved with her family to Pennsylvania, and then to Northern Virginia, where she attended school and was remembered as social, lively, and popular. In 1994, at age 28, she moved to Las Vegas. At first, she worked in high-end retail, selling cosmetics at Saks Fifth Avenue and Neiman Marcus. But the city's nightlife economy offered something bigger, better money, more flexibility, and a world that fit her personality. She eventually became a cocktail server at the Fiesta, then moved to the Palms Hotel and Casino when it opened in 2001. Friends and co-workers later described her the same way, over and over. Glamorous, funny, kind, upbeat, and always radiating energy. Las Vegas worked for Shauna because she knew how to work Vegas. She was beautiful, yes. But that was never the whole story. People liked her because she was warm, because she was funny, because she made people feel like they mattered. At the Palms, co-workers said she felt like family. Customers asked for her by name. And according to reporting on the case, she made excellent money doing that job, close to $100,000 a year between wages and tips. In a city built on performance, Shauna knew how to shine without seeming fake. She was the kind of person people remembered after one interaction. Then she met George Miguel Tiaffay, and at first he looked like the kind of man almost anyone would trust. George was younger than Shauna. He had been a standout athlete, graduated from West Point, served in the Army's Corps of Engineers, and later became a Las Vegas firefighter. Friends and family described him as charismatic, competent, generous, and deeply service-oriented. He was the kind of man who looked exceptional on paper, and for a long time, apparently looked exceptional in real life too. Prosecutors later admitted that this image, the disciplined officer, the firefighter, the family man, was one of the biggest obstacles in the entire case. Because when jurors first hear West Point graduate and firefighter, they are not imagining a murder-for-hire plot. Shauna and George met at the Palms in 2002. The relationship moved fast. They had a daughter, Maddie. In March 2006, they got married in Hawaii. And for a while, they looked like one of those couples people quietly admire and compare themselves to. Attractive, hardworking, successful, raising a little girl together in Las Vegas. Photographs from that period show beach vacations, family outings, ordinary happy moments that now look almost unbearable in hindsight. Because once you know how this story ends, every smiling picture starts to feel like evidence of how much was about to be destroyed. Then the marriage began to crack. The financial collapse of 2008 hit Las Vegas hard. The housing market fell apart. The recession tore through the city. George lost money in the real estate crash, and the couple's financial balance changed. Shauna's casino income became critically important. Detectives and reporters later pointed to money as one of the major pressure points in the relationship. But it was not just money. According to friends Shauna confided in, George became jealous, controlling, and increasingly demeaning. He criticized how she dressed for work. He made comments that humiliated her. At least one witness said he told Shauna she looked like a prostitute going to work. And worse, said it in front of their daughter. That was the kind of moment that told people close to Shauna that whatever was happening inside that marriage was no longer just stress. Something darker was taking hold. And then there was Noel Greyhound Stevens. That detail sounds minor at first. It is not. George had befriended Stevens, a homeless drifter and odd-job laborer. Some people saw that as a sign of George's generosity. His defenders later said helping homeless people was consistent with who he was. But Shauna was uneasy around Stevens. She reportedly found him creepy and unsettling. Friends said she did not like him being near the house and did not like the way George kept bringing him into their orbit. That instinct would later feel chillingly important. Because in this story, the man who scared Shauna was not some passing stranger. He was someone connected to her husband. By April 2012, Shauna had moved out. She got her own townhouse in Summerlin. She and George were separated but still legally married. They shared custody of Maddie. And despite the strain, Shauna was not fully ready to let the marriage go. They even attended counseling. Friends described her as someone who kept believing things could improve. Prosecutors later highlighted a text from Shauna to George that captured the emotional edge they were standing on. Once they were fully living apart, she believed there might be no way back. It was the language of a woman trying to face reality while still hoping reality might change. Then, just 3 weeks before the murder, someone broke into Shauna's townhouse. This was not a normal burglary. Her wedding ring was missing, her bikini bottoms were missing, and the intruder had left behind a pair of small boxer shorts. That combination immediately made the incident feel personal, invasive, and wrong in a way that went beyond theft. It sounded like obsession. It sounded like someone had entered that house not just to take valuables, but to violate her sense of safety. At the time, no one knew whether that break-in was an isolated incident, a stalker event, or the first stage of something far worse. But once the murder investigation unfolded, detectives would come to believe it was part of the plan. Now moved to the night of September 28th into September 29th, 2012. Shauna works her shift at the Palms. Just after 3 a.m., security cameras capture her leaving the casino. That footage would become the last confirmed video of Shauna alive. She drives the roughly half-hour route home. She enters through the garage. She walks inside in the dark, heading toward the stairs. And there is already someone waiting for her. The attack was catastrophic. According to investigators and later court reporting, Shauna was struck with a hammer. She raised her hands to defend herself, and her fingers were broken. The assault was so vicious that first responders initially thought one of the wounds might have been caused by a gunshot because of the depth and devastation. Prosecutors would later stress something important about that violence. This was not quick, not detached, not efficient. This was close range, prolonged, and personal. The hammer broke during the beating. The killer kept going with the metal portion. That level of force suggested rage, not just intent to kill, but the desire to obliterate. Around 9 a.m., George arrived at the townhouse with Maddie. He later said they had come by so Maddie could pick up some of her things. He noticed the garage door was open. He went inside. He found Shauna's body. Then he called 911. On that call, he sounded panicked. He said he thought he needed to report a break-in and a murder. He said his wife was on the ground, bloody, stiff, and not moving. Detectives did what detectives always do in a case like that. They started with the husband. Statistically, emotionally, and practically, he was the first person they had to eliminate. And at first glance, the circumstances pointed right at him. Separated couple, volatile marriage, dead wife inside her own home. But then his alibi checked out. George had been working a 24-hour shift at the fire station. Investigators verified it with co-workers and records. Multiple firefighters placed him there. That changed everything. Because once detectives were satisfied that George did not physically wield the hammer, the case became much more complicated. If he was innocent, then the killer might be a stranger, a stalker, a prowler, a sexual predator, someone who had followed Shauna from the casino. And if that was true, then there might be an active threat moving around Las Vegas, targeting women who worked late shifts in the gaming industry. That possibility terrified Shauna's co-workers. Investigators explored all of it. They interviewed casino staff. They reviewed surveillance. They considered whether someone from work had become fixated on Shauna. They revisited the earlier break-in. They asked whether Shauna had been seeing someone else. They pulled at every thread they could find. And for roughly 2 days, nothing gave them a clean path forward. Then a man named William Big Will Penix called police, and the entire case shifted. Penix told detectives that a friend of his had confessed to killing a woman with a hammer. That mattered immediately because the hammer detail had not been widely publicized. Big Will said the man seemed almost pleased with himself, not shaken, not horrified, but upbeat, like he had completed a job. He knew the man by the nickname Greyhound. Big Will had tried to help him in the past, but this was different. If what Greyhound said was true, then Big Will believed he had a moral obligation to go to the police. That decision made him one of the key civilians in the entire case. Big Will helped detectives look for Greyhound, near places he was known to frequent. They found him. His real name was Noel Stevens. Police approached him, found drugs in his possession, and used that to bring him in while they pursued the homicide angle. At first, Stevens denied involvement. But detectives searched the remote desert area where he had been staying and started finding the kind of evidence that changes interviews into confessions. Bloody jeans containing Shauna's blood, items linking him to the prior break-in, and evidence connected to the murder weapon. Once those discoveries were in place, Noel Stevens was no longer a random drifter with a wild story. He was the man who killed Shauna Tiaffay. Then detectives checked his phone. And that is when they found George, not just George's number, a communication pattern that mattered. According to the prosecution, George Tiaffay had called Noel Stevens 87 times during the month before Shauna's murder, and 5 times the night before she was killed. That was devastating because it provided structure, not just suspicion. If George barely knew Noel, those calls made no sense. If Noel was lying about being close to George, those calls made no sense. If George had nothing to do with the murder, those calls made no sense. The phone records did not prove conspiracy by themselves, but they made the state's theory suddenly believable. Stevens eventually admitted killing Shauna. Then he said George hired him to do it. According to trial reporting and later television coverage, Stevens said George first floated the idea, then raised the offer, eventually promising him thousands of dollars, though Stevens ultimately received only about $600 up front. More importantly, Stevens described planning, repeated planning. He said George gave him a key to Shauna's townhouse. He said they talked through different methods. They considered staging an accident. They considered other ways to kill her. In the end, they settled on the townhouse. According to Stevens, the earlier break-in had been a rehearsal, a dry run, a chance to enter the home and understand the layout. That is why the break-in had felt so strange. Because it was not just burglary. It was reconnaissance. Then came one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the case. Lowe's surveillance. Police tracked the hammer purchase through a barcode and recovered video showing George Tiaffay and Noel Stevens together in the store, buying the tools connected to the crime. Reporting on the case described the footage as overwhelming. The husband and the eventual killer were not just casually crossing paths. They were shopping together before the murder, and prosecutors used that video exactly the way you would expect, as the visual collapse of George's innocence narrative. He had not just known Noel, he had been with him, preparing. Stevens also led police to where he had buried the hammerhead. That mattered because it corroborated his account in a way fabricated stories usually do not. When a suspect can take you to physical evidence hidden away from public view, his credibility changes. Detectives said again and again that Stevens was far from an ideal witness. He had a record, he used drugs, he lied, he had mental health issues. But parts of his story kept leading them to real things, in real places that matched the crime. And that is the difference between a wild accusation and a prosecutable statement. At that point, Detectives believed George was not just involved. They believed he was in danger of making another move, because now Noel Stevens knew too much. Investigators later said they thought George might even have been preparing to get rid of Noel. That suspicion fed into how they handled the next phase. Detectives spoke to George's family, making it clear that he was under serious scrutiny. Soon after, George's sister called him. And not long after that, police watched George speed away, get onto Summerlin Parkway, and drive into a barrier at roughly 90 miles per hour in what investigators considered an intentional crash. He survived. They arrested him at the hospital. One detective later said that when George was informed he was under arrest for Shauna's murder, he simply said, "Okay." Now the case moved toward trial. And the state had a serious problem. Not with the facts, with the witness. Because Noel Stevens was going to be the prosecution's central insider witness, and he was exactly the kind of person a defense lawyer wants, standing between the jury and a murder conviction. He was a homeless ex-con. He admitted criminal conduct. He admitted drug use. He admitted hallucinations. The defense could say what they needed the jury to believe. Yes, Noel killed Shauna, but Noel is also unstable, unreliable, and fully capable of inventing an elaborate story about George to save himself from death row. That became the core strategy. George's trial began in August 2015. The prosecution's theory was not subtle. George had a motive: money, control, resentment, and a marriage falling apart. George had access. He knew Shauna's routines, her home, her fears, and her vulnerability. George had the relationship with Noel Stevens. George had the calls. George had the Lowe's video. George had the staging. George had the reason to want Shauna dead without personally being present. And Noel, in their theory, was the weapon. During the trial, the jury heard the 911 call. They heard about the prior burglary, and they saw the surveillance from the casino and the hardware store. They heard about the phone records, and then they heard Noel Stevens describe the murder. He said Shauna asked him why he was doing this. He said he struck her with the hammer. He said he kept hitting her until she stopped moving. He said Shauna Tiaffay sent him. Those details were horrifying on their own. But what made them powerful in court was not just the horror. It was the overlap between Noel's account and the physical evidence. The broken hammer, the blood, the timeline, the burglary, the purchase footage, the calls. The more the state layered corroboration around him, the harder it became for the jury to dismiss him as just a liar. The defense attacked hard. They highlighted Noel's mental instability. They emphasized that he heard voices and saw things. They argued that the shopping trip could have been innocent, just a firefighter buying tools with a handyman who sometimes did work for him. They pointed out that George never physically committed the murder. They insisted the prosecution was building a neat story out of ugly people and ugly coincidences. And George himself did not testify. His defense called family members and supporters to talk about his character instead. This is important because it shows what the defense knew the battlefield really was. They were not trying to compete with the brutality of Shauna's death. They were trying to preserve George's image, to keep jurors emotionally anchored to the firefighter, the West Point graduate, the family man. But image has limits, especially when evidence starts stacking. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Then, on September 3, 2015, they came back with guilty verdicts across the board, including first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Additional counts included burglary, robbery-related charges, and weapon-related findings tied to the plan and the execution. For Shauna's family, the verdict was confirmation of what they had believed from the beginning, that George had not been the grieving husband in this story. He had been the hidden engine behind it. Then came the penalty phase, and this part mattered because the jury had options. They could leave open the possibility of parole. They could decide that even though George was guilty, there should still be a point decades down the line when he might walk out of prison. They did not. On December 1, 2015, Shauna Tiaffay was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for Shauna's murder. The judge called it pure evil. Later reporting also noted that George picked up additional consecutive prison time on the remaining counts. The message was unmistakable. Whatever good George had done in other chapters of his life, this crime defined the sentence. Noel Stevens was sentenced separately. In January 2016, he received 42 years to life for the murder after pleading guilty and cooperating. That sentence reflected both realities at once. He was absolutely guilty, and he was also not the person the state believed had conceived the crime. In the prosecution's framing, Noel was the man who swung the hammer. George was the man who created the conditions for that hammer to land. George did not stop fighting after that. In later appeals and post-conviction filings, he argued ineffective assistance of counsel and claimed that medications and mental health issues had altered his judgment. In one filing, he effectively admitted criminal conduct while trying to explain it away. Nevada appellate records show his efforts to overturn the conviction failed. His sentence stood. Years later, federal habeas filings continued, but the underlying conviction was not undone. But the end of appeals is not the end of the story. Because cases like this never end where the court file ends. They end in absences, in birthdays, in graduations, in children growing older without the parent who should have been there. Shauna was 46 years old when she was killed. She had spent years building a life in Las Vegas, years working nights, years raising her daughter, years believing, at least longer than she should have been forced to, that the marriage might still be repaired. Her obituary and the later reporting around the case make the same point in different ways. Her greatest joy was being a mother. That is the human center of this case. Not the hammer, not the conspiracy, not the courtroom strategy. The center is that a child lost her mother because the person who should have protected that family instead destroyed it. And that is why this case lingers. Because it does not just feel brutal, it feels inverted. The firefighter is supposed to save lives. The husband is supposed to protect the mother of his child. The home is supposed to be the safe place. Instead, prosecutors proved the opposite narrative. The danger came from inside the marriage, from inside the trust, from inside the man everyone thought they understood. There is another reason it stays with people. Shauna had already been telling the truth with her fear. She had been uncomfortable with Noel Stevens. She had been telling people George had changed. She had been telling friends about the control, the anger, the cruelty. And yet when a man has enough status, enough discipline, enough polish, and the right public identity, those warning signs are easy for the outside world to underrate. That is part of what makes this case feel so cold. The state did not present George as a chaotic killer who snapped in the moment. They presented him as a planner, a man who stayed at work, preserved his alibi, let another man do the violence, then arrived later to discover the body with his daughter in tow. That is not impulsive evil. That is structured evil. And for Shauna's family, the cruelty did not stop with her death, because they had to live with the details. That she came home from work expecting nothing more than sleep. That she was attacked inside her own home. That she fought back. That her fingers broke trying to protect herself. That her daughter would grow up with this as part of her life story. That every family memory after September 2012 would have an empty space in it. After the conviction, Shauna's family became associated with Justice for Shauna, using the case to speak about domestic violence and coercive control. Even without reducing this case to a slogan, that makes sense. Because what happened to Shauna did not begin the night Noel Stevens walked into that townhouse. It began earlier, with humiliation, controlling behavior, fear, economic pressure, manipulation, and a husband prosecutors said refused to lose control of his family. The murder was the final act. The abuse of power came first. And maybe that is the final thing worth saying about Shauna Tiaffay. She should not be remembered only for the brutality of how she died. She should be remembered for who she was before this case ever existed. A woman born in Utah, a girl who moved across states and built a life from scratch, a cocktail server who turned long nights into a career, a sister remembered for laughter, a mother remembered as sweet devoted, and fully present. A woman whose life contained far more than the violence that ended it. Because that is what murder cases do if you let them. They reduce a person to the last room, the last wound, the last night, the last breath. And Shauna was much more than that. She was not born as evidence. She was not put on this earth to become a headline about a firefighter who hired a hitman. She was a full life. And if there is any justice beyond the verdict, it is this. George Tiaffay gets remembered for what he did. Shauna gets remembered for who she was. Thank you to everyone who watched this video. We truly hope this story mattered to you. And if you'd like to support the channel and help us continue creating content, please like the video, leave a comment, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support really makes a difference, and we genuinely appreciate every person who helps keep these stories from being forgotten.